you were just playing. Oh, you were actually being chosen.
It's our little secret.
Picture this. You're 5 years old again, sitting on the floor of your bedroom. You're never alone, because you have a special friend, one that only you can see. They have a funny name, a secret handshake, and they listen to all your stories, Dot. It's your imaginary friend, a harmless, comforting creation of a child's mind. Now, imagine growing up and realizing that the friend you created was actually something else entirely, something real. Today, we're going to share 8 true, deeply unsettling accounts from people whose childhood imaginary friend was not imaginary at all. We all look back on childhood with a certain nostalgia, a belief in its innocence and safety. But what if that safety was an illusion? The real horror is the violation of that sacred memory, Dot. It's the chilling realization that while your parents thought you were playing alone in your room, you were actually in the company of a real unknown entity, Dot, an entity with its own motives, its own secrets, an entity that was watching your family, learning from you, and hiding in plain sight. But what if these weren't random hauntings? By exploring these real stories, from a mysterious man in a striped suit to a little girl who lived in a closet, we're going to uncover the disturbing patterns and the shocking truths behind these impossible childhood companions. These stories are more than just creepy tales. They are a terrifying look into what happens when the veil between worlds is thin enough for a child to reach through, and for something else to reach back. Now, before we revisit those childhood secrets, make sure you are subscribed to Whispered Fear and have activated the bell. You don't want to be the only one who doesn't know who you were really talking to.
Don't tell your parents.
Our first story comes from a man named Leo, who learned that the most dangerous monsters are the ones we invite into our lives, the ones we give a name to, the ones we call friend. It's a story about how the beautiful, boundless imagination of a child can become a hunting ground for a very real and very patient predator. My story doesn't begin with a haunting, but with a memory, a perfect, sun-drenched memory of being 6 years old in Raleigh, North Carolina. Dot, we lived in a modest, 2-story house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in the North Hills neighborhood. For me and my younger sister, Maya, the world was a safe and wondrous place. Our father worked long hours as a project manager for a construction firm, often coming home smelling of sawdust and concrete. Our mother was a part-time nurse at Rex Hospital. Her shifts are chaotic. Dance that often left her exhausted, but always with a smile for us. Dot, we weren't wealthy, but we were happy. Our world was a fortress of mundane, suburban love. The best part of our house was the backyard. Dot, it wasn't large, but it was bordered on 3 sides by a deep, untamed stretch of woods, a remnant of the old forests that once covered the state. Dot, to my parents, the woods were a privacy screen. Dot, to me, they were a kingdom, a place of endless adventures, of forts built from fallen branches, and of imaginary creatures that lived in the dappled sunlight. And it was there, in the woods, that I met Mr. Stripes. He wasn't like my other imaginary friends, the clumsy dragons or talking squirrels. Mr. Stripes was different. He was a man. Very tall, very thin man who wore a dark pinstripe suit. Even in the humid heat of a Carolina summer, he never came into the yard. He would just stand at the edge of the woods, right where the manicured lawn met the chaotic tangle of undergrowth. He was my secret. Our games were quiet ones. He told me he didn't like loud noises. Our favorite game was the quiet game. He would stand among the trees, and I would have to sneak up on him without making a sound. I never won. No matter how silently I crept. When I finally looked up, he would be gone, only to reappear a few moments later in a different spot, his tall, thin form partially obscured by a tree trunk. He was teaching me to be silent, to be observant. Another game we played was the watching game. I would sit on the back porch, and he would stand in the woods, and we would just watch my house. His voice was a dry rustle, like leaves skittering across pavement. "What do you see, Leo?" I would describe the mundane details of my own life. "Mommy is in the kitchen. She's making cookies. Daddy is in the garage, fixing the lawnmower. Mr. Stripes would listen patiently and nod. He seemed fascinated by the simple, predictable rhythms of our lives. To my parents, I was just an imaginative, slightly solitary child. They would see me talking to myself at the edge of the woods and smile. My mom would ask, "Who are you talking to, sweetie?" I'd say, "Mr. Stripes. He's my best friend." They saw it as a harmless phase, a sign of a creative mind. They had no reason to think otherwise. Mr. Stripes was my secret, a comforting, silent presence in my life, a presence I now understand was something else entirely. The first crack in my idyllic reality was a drawing. My mom had given me a new box of crayons, and I spent an entire afternoon drawing a picture of my family. I drew my dad, tall and smiling, my mom with her kind eyes, my sister Maya, a small stick figure with bright yellow hair, and standing next to me, I drew Mr. Stripes. I drew him exactly as I saw him, very tall, very thin, in his dark suit with the faint white pinstripes. I gave him a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his head. I left his face blank, because I had never really seen his face clearly. It was always in the shadows of the trees, or obscured by his hat. I proudly presented the drawing to my mother that evening. She looked at it, and a strange expression crossed her face, a flicker of something I couldn't identify then, but now recognize as a deep, maternal unease. She asked, pointing to the tall figure. "Who is this, honey?" "That's Mr. Stripes," I said happily. Her voice was a little tight. "He's very detailed." She looked at my father. "Don't you think it's a little strange, Mark?" "The suit?" My father, tired from a long day, just glanced at it and chuckled. "He's got a better tailor than I do. The boy's got an imagination, that's all." But my mother kept the drawing. She didn't put it on the refrigerator with my other creations. She folded it carefully and put it in a drawer in the kitchen. I know now that she was starting a file. The incidents became more frequent, more specific. One night, at dinner, I casually mentioned something Mr. Stripes had told me. Mr. Stripes says, "Mommy's car makes a funny clicking noise when it's cold." My mom's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. She and my dad exchanged a look. Her car had been making a strange noise, a problem she had only mentioned to my father in hushed tones, worried about the cost of a repair. There was no way I could have known that. My mom asked, her voice carefully neutral. "How did Mr. Stripes know that, Leo?" I said simply, taking another bite of my mashed potatoes. "He sees things." The atmosphere in the house began to change. It was subtle. My parents didn't forbid me from playing with Mr. Stripes, but they started watching me more closely. My mom would stand at the kitchen window for long periods, just staring out at the woods behind our house. My dad started making a point of locking the back door, even during the day. The dog, a lazy old golden retriever named Sam, started acting strangely. He would lie by the back door, the fur on his back raised, and let out a low, persistent growl at the silent, watching trees. One Saturday afternoon, my parents were having a barbecue in the backyard with some neighbors. I was playing near the edge of the woods, talking to Mr. Stripes, who was standing in his usual spot, just inside the tree line. My father was laughing at a joke with our neighbor, Mr. Henderson, when his eyes drifted over towards me, and his laughter died in his throat. My mother saw the change in his expression and followed his gaze. She whispered, "What is it?" My father's face was pale. He said in a low voice, "Don't make a scene, but look, over by the big oak tree. Do you see that?" My mother squinted, and then she saw him. Not an imaginary friend, not a trick of the light, but the distinct, unmistakable shape of a tall, thin man in a dark suit, standing partially hidden behind a tree at the edge of their property, watching their child. She breathed, "My God." Mr. Henderson, noticing their sudden silence, looked over. "Everything okay, Mark?" My father forced a smile. "Yeah, just thought I saw a deer." He turned back to the grill, but his movements were stiff, his eyes wide with a fear he was trying desperately to conceal. He spent the rest of the barbecue with his back to the woods, a physical barrier between his family and the silent observer in the trees. That night, after Maya and I were in bed, I heard my parents arguing in hushed, frantic tones downstairs that my dad whispered harshly that it was a person, Sarah. "A real person. I'm calling the police." My mom hissed back, "And say what?" "That we saw a man standing in the woods. They'll think we're crazy. He didn't do anything. He was just standing there." They didn't call the police that night. They didn't want to seem like paranoid suburbanites. They decided to wait. To watch. It was a decision my father would regret for the rest of his life. The next day, a Sunday, was my sister Maya's 4th birthday. She had gotten a new, bright red tricycle, and she was desperate to ride it. My dad took us to a small, paved park just down the street, Millbrook Exchange Park. I remember the day was bright and sunny, a perfect autumn afternoon. My dad was pushing Maya on the swings, and I was sitting on a bench, a little bored. Mr. Stripes never came to the park. He only ever stayed in the woods behind our house. I was watching my dad and sister when a thought, a voice, a whisper that wasn't my own, slid into my mind. It was Mr. Stripes' voice, dry and rustling. "Maya is going to fall. The chain on the swing is old. It's going to break. You have to tell them." A cold fear washed over me. I looked at the swing. The chains looked fine. My dad was pushing her gently, but the voice in my head was insistent. "Tell them now, Leo, before it's too late." I jumped off the bench and ran towards them, screaming, "Daddy, stop! Stop! Mr. Stripes says the swing is going to break." My dad stopped pushing, a look of annoyance on his face. "Leo, what are you talking about? It's fine. Don't scare your sister." I insisted, tears welling in my eyes. "No. Mr. Stripes told me. He said it's old." To humor me, my father inspected the chain, running his hands along the metal links. "See?" he said. "It's perfectly strong." He gave the swing another gentle push, and at the peak of its arc, the rusted hook connecting the chain to the top bar snapped with a loud, sharp crack. The world seemed to move in slow motion. The swing, with my sister still on it, flew forward, untethered. Maya let out a terrified scream as she was thrown through the air, landing in a heap in the wood chips below. My dad and I ran to her. She was crying, her arm bent at an unnatural angle. It was broken. Badly. The next few hours were a blur of the emergency room at WakeMed, of doctors, of x-rays, of my sister's pained sobs. But all I could think about was Mr. Stripes. He had known. He had warned me. He had saved her from something worse. He wasn't just my friend. He was my protector. When we finally got home that evening, my parents were silent, their faces etched with a new, deeper kind of fear. My mother put Maya to bed, her arm now in a bright pink cast. My father walked out into the backyard and stood at the edge of the lawn, staring into the dark, silent woods. He stood there for a long time. Later that night, I woke up. I don't know why. The house was silent. I slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the window of my room, which overlooked the backyard, and I saw him. My father was standing in the middle of the lawn, a heavy flashlight in one hand and a baseball bat in the other. He was just standing there, a lone sentinel in the darkness. Then, from the edge of the woods, a figure emerged. Tall, thin, and wearing a dark pinstriped suit. Mr. Stripes. He didn't come into the yard. He just stood at the tree line, a silent silhouette against the deeper darkness. The two men, my father and my secret friend, stood facing each other across the expanse of the lawn. They didn't speak. They didn't move. It was a silent, terrifying standoff. And then another figure emerged from the woods, and another, and another. 3 more men, all tall, all thin, all dressed in dark, pinstriped suits. They stood beside the first Mr. Stripes, a silent, uniform quartet of impossible figures. My father took a single, involuntary step back. The beam of his flashlight trembled. I knew then, with the strange, unburdened clarity of a child, what this was. Mr. Stripes wasn't just one person. He was a part of something, a group, and they had been watching us all along. The man my parents had seen at the barbecue wasn't the same man from the park incident. They were a team. The 4 figures in the woods slowly, in perfect unison, raised their hands and gave a small, formal wave. It wasn't a friendly gesture. It was a signal, a farewell. And then they simply melted back into the trees and were gone. My father stood in the yard for another hour before finally coming inside, his face pale and defeated. The next day, a for sale sign was hammered into our front lawn. We moved a month later to a new house in a new neighborhood, one with a small, fenced-in yard, and no woods anywhere nearby. My parents never spoke of Mr. Stripes again. I tried to ask my dad about it once. Years later, he just looked at me with a deep, haunted sadness in his eyes and said, "Some things are better left in the past, son. I am 32 years old. Now, I have a family of my own. I live in a high-rise apartment in a city, surrounded by concrete and steel. But I have never forgotten. The memory of Mr. Stripes, my imaginary friend, is not a comfort. It is a cold, hard knot of fear in my stomach. The games we played were not games. They were lessons in stealth. The watching was not a game. It was surveillance. The warning about the swing was not an act of protection. It was a demonstration of knowledge, a display of power. They weren't ghosts. They weren't supernatural. They were real, a silent, patient, organized group of men who lived in the woods behind our house and watched the intimate details of our lives. Why? For what purpose? I will never know. And that is the most terrifying part. I now understand that the greatest horror doesn't come from monsters or demons. It comes from the quiet, smiling man in the well-tailored suit who watches your children play. From the shadows, the man you invite into your life without ever knowing he's real.
Can we kneel now? Please,
Our second story is about the secrets that houses keep. It comes from a woman named Sophie, who learned that the most cherished friendship of her childhood was built upon a foundation of unimaginable horror, and that the whispers she heard from her closet were not the product of her imagination, but a desperate cry for help from a place she never knew existed. My story begins with a memory of being lonely. I was 7 years old, an only child living in a sprawling old Victorian house in the Lincoln Park neighborhood of Chicago. We lived on North Dayton Street, in a house that my parents, both busy attorneys, had bought for a steal because it needed a universe of work. They were always busy, at their offices, at Baker McKenzie, at client dinners, at court. They loved me. I never doubted that they were perpetually distracted. And so, I was often left to my own devices in the vast, echoing rooms of our new home. The house, with its strange layout and forgotten corners, became my entire world. And in the heart of that world, in the back of my bedroom closet, I found a friend. Her name was Lily. She wasn't like the other kids at school. She was quiet, shy. She never wanted to play outside. She only wanted to play in my closet. Our friendship began with whispers. I was in my room, playing with my dolls, when I heard it. A soft, rustling sound from inside my deep walk-in closet, followed by a whisper so faint I thought it was the wind. Hello? I wasn't scared. I was curious. I walked to the closet and peered into the darkness. I asked, "Who's there?" The voice whispered back from the very back wall, "I'm Lily. Do you want to be friends?" And just like that, I wasn't lonely anymore. My parents were thrilled. They'd hear me laughing and talking in my room for hours and assumed I was finally coming out of my shell. My mom would say on the phone, "Sophie's made a new friend. Her name is Lily. She's imaginary, of course, but it's so good for her development." They thought it was cute. A harmless fantasy. They had no idea that Lily was real. Our games were dictated by Lily's rules. We could only play at night, or when my parents weren't home. We had to be very, very quiet. Our primary mode of communication was through a small, loose floorboard at the very back of the closet. I would lie on my stomach, my face pressed to the crack, and we would whisper for hours. Sometimes we would exchange things. I would pass her a cookie I had saved from dinner, or one of my dolls. A few hours later, the doll would be passed back, sometimes with a new, clumsily braided hairstyle. Lily told me she lived in the quiet place, a special, secret room behind my closet. It was our world, a kingdom of two built in the hidden spaces of the old house. As a child, you don't question the logistics of magic. You accept it. I accepted that Lily couldn't come out into my room. I accepted that she was always hungry, always cold. I would leave her small portions of my dinner, pushing them through. The crack in the floorboard, I would leave her one of my sweaters, which would be gone in the morning. To me, these were acts of friendship. I now know they were acts of survival. There were things, of course, that my child's mind couldn't process. Clues that something was deeply wrong. Sometimes, Lily's whispers would be strained, pained. Sometimes, she would have bruises on the small, pale hand she would occasionally stick through the crack to take a toy. When I asked, she would just whisper, "I fell down." Sometimes, she would be deathly afraid of loud noises. If my father raised his voice downstairs, or if a door slammed, Lily would go silent for hours, sometimes days. I would lie by the closet, whispering her name, but there would be no response. Thought she was just sensitive. I didn't understand that she was terrified, conditioned by a different, much louder man's voice. My parents, in their busy, loving ignorance, also missed the signs. The food that would occasionally go missing from the pantry, they blamed on mice. The faint noises they would sometimes hear in the walls, they attributed to the groans of an old house. They were logical explanations for an illogical situation. The truth was too monstrous to even consider. One of the most vivid and, in retrospect, most horrifying memories I have is of my favorite doll, a porcelain doll named Annabelle. I had passed her to Lily to play with. A week went by, and she didn't return her. I was sad, but Lily whispered that she just loved her so much and wanted to keep her a little longer. A month later, I found Annabelle back in my toy box, but she was different. Her silk dress was stained and torn. Her porcelain face was smudged with dirt. And one of her tiny, delicate legs had been snapped clean off. I cried, and Lily whispered apologies through the wall, saying it was an accident. I understand now that a broken doll's leg was likely the price of Lily's own survival, a toy sacrificed to an abuser's rage. Our strange, secret friendship continued for 2 years. 2 years of whispered conversations, of shared secrets, of a child's innocent complicity in a horror she could not comprehend. And then, we moved. My father's firm transferred him to their San Francisco office. The move was a whirlwind of packing boxes and emotional goodbyes. The hardest goodbye was to Lily. I lay by the closet on our last night in the house, tears streaming down my face. I promised I would never forget her. I told her to be safe. Her last whisper to me was, "I'm scared. It's so dark in the quiet place when you're not here." I pushed our last cookie through the crack and promised I would write. It was a promise I could never keep. Life went on. We moved to California. I grew up. The memory of Lily faded, softening into the gauzy, dreamlike nostalgia of early childhood. She became, even in my own mind, what my parents had always believed her to be, an imaginary friend. Figment of a lonely child's imagination. It was easier that way. The truth did not come for another 20 years. I was 29, a successful architect living in Chicago. My parents had decided to sell the old house on North Dayton Street. It had been a rental property for years, and they were tired of being landlords. They asked me to fly in for a final weekend to help them clear out some old family belongings that had been stored in the attic. Walking back into that house was like stepping into a dream. The layout was the same, but it felt smaller, less magical. I walked up to my old bedroom. The walls were painted a neutral beige, but I could still see the faint outline where my posters used to be. And there, in the corner, was the closet. A wave of nostalgia so powerful it almost knocked me off my feet, washed over me. I remembered Lily. I remembered our whispered secrets, our shared games. A sad smile touched my lips. I opened the closet door. It was just a closet. Dark, empty, smelling faintly of cedar and mothballs. On a whim, a foolish, childish impulse, I knelt down, just as I had all those years ago. I placed my cheek against the cold wood of the back wall and whispered, my voice thick with a nostalgia I couldn't explain. Lily, are you in there? I expected only silence. The silence of memory. But what I got was a sound. A soft, terrified gasp from the other side of the wall. And then, a voice. It was not a child's voice. It was the weak, hoarse, and trembling voice of a young woman. Who's there? Is that you, Sophie? The world tilted on its axis. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't my imagination. It was real. Lily was real, and she was still in there. I don't remember the next few minutes clearly. I remember screaming for my dad. I remember the sound of him running up the stairs. I remember trying to explain the impossible, my words a jumbled, hysterical mess. But my father, seeing the look of pure, unadulterated terror on my face, didn't question me. He called 911. The Chicago PD arrived. Their presence a jarring intrusion of official reality into my childhood nightmare. At first, they were skeptical, but when I showed them the loose floorboard, they became serious. They brought in a thermal imaging camera, and on the screen, they saw it. A faint human-shaped heat signature, huddled in the space behind the closet wall. They didn't knock. They used a sledgehammer. The sound of the plaster and lath shattering echoed through the old house. With each blow, I felt like a piece of my own childhood was being destroyed. When they finally broke through, they shone their flashlights into the space behind. It was a room, a small, windowless, hidden chamber. No bigger than a large closet. It was filthy, squalid. And in the corner, huddled on a pile of old, dirty blankets, was a woman. She was pale, emaciated, her hair a tangled mess, her eyes wide, with a terror that had been her only companion for 2 decades. She was Lily. The story that unfolded was a horror beyond anything my 7-year-old mind could have conceived. Lily's parents, the tenants who had lived in the house before us, were monsters. Her father was a violent, abusive man. The quiet place was where he locked her for days on end as punishment. When they decided to move out of state, they couldn't be bothered with the complication of a child. So they left her behind. They sealed her in the hidden room, a living ghost in the walls, and disappeared. She had survived. For 20 years, she had survived. She was a feral creature, a survivor who had lived in the dark, sneaking out into our house at night, a silent ghost in our home. The food I had passed her through the floorboard, the scraps she had stolen from our kitchen that had been her sustenance. The whispers we shared had been her only human contact. My parents' dismissal of the strange noises, of the missing food, had, in a horrifying twist of fate, been the very thing that had kept her alive, and her secret safe. I stood there in the hallway, watching as the paramedics gently led her out of the house, blinking against the sun she hadn't felt in years, and I finally understood my most cherished, most magical childhood secret wasn't a story of imagination. It was a story of abuse, of survival, of a tragedy so profound it had hidden itself in plain sight. The games I had played with the little girl in my closet were real, but I had been the only one who was playing.
Sing it again.
Our next story is about the power of a simple melody. It comes from a man named Caleb, a musician who learned that the most innocent song from his childhood was not a memory of joy, but the echo of a forgotten, terrifying secret. He discovered that his imaginary friend wasn't a playmate, but a ghost of a different kind, a living one, whose voice carried over the walls of one of America's most infamous asylums. My story, like many, begins with a memory that feels warm to the touch. It's the summer of 1994. I'm 8 years old, a quiet, solitary boy living in a small, clapboard house on the outskirts of Weston, West Virginia. Our house was situated on a small hill, surrounded by dense woods, a place where the Appalachian foothills began to assert their ancient, rolling presence. My father was a lineman for Monongahela Power, his job demanding long, unpredictable hours, especially during the frequent mountain storms. My mother worked as a clerk at the local courthouse. They were good, hard-working people, but their lives were a constant battle against bills and exhaustion. I was often left to my own devices, a ghost in my own home, my only real companion, the woods and the secrets they held. And from our backyard, through a gap in the trees, you could see it, looming on the horizon like a stone giant, its spires and towers cutting a jagged silhouette against the sky. The Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. Even then, in the 90s, the asylum was mostly decommissioned, a sleeping dragon of sandstone and sorrow, but parts of it were still operational, housing a handful of long-term patients. For the kids in town, it was a place of legend, a source of 1,000 ghost stories. But for me, it was just a part of the landscape, a silent, brooding neighbor. It was during that long, hot summer that I met the singer. He wasn't a friend I could see, like the other kids had. He was a voice, a sad, beautiful voice that would drift through the woods to my backyard on quiet afternoons. He would sing a strange, simple song, a lullaby that felt both ancient and deeply personal. The melody was haunting, a simple looping tune in a minor key. The words were nonsensical, childlike. The river is deep. The moon is a spoon. The rabbit in the briar is sleeping till noon. I was a lonely kid. That voice, that song, became my secret friend. I named him the singer. I would sit on our rickety back porch for hours, just listening, waiting for him to begin. I imagined him as an old, kind man who lived in a cabin deep in the woods, a gentle hermit who sang to the birds. It never occurred to me to question where the voice was really coming from. It was just there, a private concert for an audience of one. My parents barely noticed. They were too wrapped up in their own struggles to pay much attention to the quiet boy who spent his days listening to the wind in the trees. One evening, at dinner, I was humming the tune. My mother paused, a forkful of green beans halfway to her mouth. "What a pretty song, Caleb. Where did you learn that?" "From the singer," I said matter-of-factly. My father asked, not looking up from his plate. "And who is that?" I replied. "He's my friend. He lives in the woods and he sings to me." My mother smiled, that tired, gentle smile of hers. "That's nice, honey." And that was the end of it. To them, the singer was just another imaginary friend, a harmless creation to fill the empty hours. The idea that the voice was real, that it was coming from the imposing stone fortress on the horizon, was too absurd, too terrifying to even consider. The song became my personal anthem. I hummed it when I was scared. I sang it to myself to fall asleep. It was the soundtrack to my childhood. The singer was the most reliable presence in my life. He was always there, his sad, beautiful voice, a constant, comforting presence. There was only one time his song was different. It was late one afternoon. A storm was rolling in over the mountains, the sky a bruised purple. The singer began his usual melody, but his voice was strained, full of a desperate, ragged anger I had never heard before. He wasn't singing the words. He was screaming them. The simple, nonsensical lyrics became a terrifying, guttural chant. It was the sound of a soul in agony. I sat on the porch, frozen, clutching my knees to my chest, as the tormented voice echoed through the trees. Then, it was cut off by a sound I would never forget. A single piercing scream of pure terror, followed by an absolute chilling silence. I never heard the singer again. I waited for days, for weeks, but the woods remained silent. I told myself he had simply moved away, that my gentle hermit had found a new place to live. But a small, cold part of me, a part I buried deep down, knew that something terrible had happened. Eventually, like all childhood memories, the story of the singer faded, softened by the passing of time. I grew up, went to college, and moved away from the little house in Weston. I became a musician, a composer for independent films. The memory of my imaginary friend became just that, a memory, a strange, quirky footnote in the story of a lonely boy. 25 years later, that footnote became the terrifying centerpiece of my life. I was living in Asheville, North Carolina, with my wife and our own young son. I was working on a score for a documentary. The film was about the history of mental health treatment in Appalachia, and the director had sent me a drive full of archival material, old photos, documents, and hours of raw audio recordings from various institutions. The director, a man named Sam, was a stickler for authenticity. He wanted the score to be infused with the real sounds of these places. I spent a week listening to the recordings. It was grueling, emotionally heavy work. The audio was mostly poor quality. Interviews with staff from the 70s, recordings of patient therapy sessions, the ambient sounds of hospital wards. Most of it was from a place I knew well, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in my old hometown of Weston. I was listening to a track labeled Tia Ella, Ward B, Ambient Recording, 1994. The audio was a low-quality hiss, filled with the distant sounds of echoing footsteps and muffled, indistinct chatter. It was the sound of my own history. I was about to skip to the next track when I heard it. Underneath the hiss, faint but unmistakable, was a voice. A man's voice, singing, a sad, haunting melody in a minor key. The river is deep, the moon is a spoon. I ripped the headphones from my ears, my heart seizing in my chest. My hands were shaking. It was impossible. It was the song, my song, the song of the singer, but it wasn't a beautiful voice. It was thin, reedy, and full of a profound, heartbreaking sadness. I put the headphones back on, my blood roaring in my ears, and listened to the rest of the recording. The man on the tape sang the entire song, the same strange, nonsensical lyrics I remembered from my childhood. After the song ended, another voice, a younger man, likely a nurse or an orderly, spoke on the recording. "That's enough singing for today, Mr. Abernathy. Time for your medication." Abernathy. The name was a key, and it had just unlocked a door in my mind I had sealed shut for decades. I spent the next 2 days in a frantic, obsessive spiral of research. I ignored my work, my family. I dug through online archives, historical records, anything I could find about the asylum in the mid-90s, and I found him. Patient file number 734. Daniel Abernathy. Admitted in 1982, for extreme paranoid schizophrenia and violent tendencies. He had been a music teacher before his illness consumed him. The file noted his obsession with a single self-composed lullaby that he would sing for hours on end from the window of his room in Ward B. The file also noted his periods of extreme agitation, often triggered by thunderstorms, which would result in violent, screaming outbursts, and it noted the date of his death, October 14th, 1994. The cause was listed as self-inflicted trauma during a period of severe agitation. He had died during a thunderstorm, the same day I had heard the singer scream. The truth crashed down on me, shattering the sanitized, nostalgic memory of my childhood. The singer wasn't a gentle hermit in the woods. He was a patient in the asylum's high-security ward. The beautiful voice that had been my only friend hadn't been drifting from a cabin. It had been drifting from a barred window on the asylum's upper floor, a window that had a direct, unobstructed line of sight to the backyard of my childhood home. My imaginary friend, my secret companion, the man who taught me his song, was a real, deeply disturbed, and potentially violent man. The realization was a physical blow. I felt sick. The song, my song, the melody that had brought me so much comfort, was now tainted, poisoned by a horrifying new context. That it wasn't the song of friendship, that it was the desperate, obsessive rambling of a madman. But the story had one final, terrifying twist. In the patient file, there was a grainy, black and white photograph of Daniel Abernathy, taken upon his admission in 1982. It was a standard, clinical photo. But the man in the picture, I knew him. His face was thin, his eyes dark and haunted. Was the face I had created in my own mind for the singer, the kind, gentle hermit I had imagined living in the woods. The two faces, the real and the imaginary, were one and the same. But how? I had never seen him. I had only ever heard his voice. How could I have possibly imagined his face with such perfect, terrifying accuracy? I kept digging. I found an old, digitized local newspaper article from the Weston Democrat about the asylum, dated from the summer of 1994. It was a human interest piece about the remaining patients, and there was a photograph. It showed a group of patients in the asylum's dreary, walled-in courtyard. In the background, sitting alone on a bench, was Daniel Abernathy, and standing at the chain-link fence, his small hands wrapped around the wire, peering in, was a small, lonely-looking boy with a familiar shock of brown hair. It was me. A forgotten memory, buried under 25 years of denial, came rushing back. I had seen him. One day, my curiosity had gotten the better of me. I had walked through the woods, all the way to the asylum's perimeter fence. I had stood there, watching the strange, sad men inside, and one of them, a thin man with haunted eyes, had looked back at me. He hadn't spoken. He had just started to sing my song. My mind, in an act of self-preservation, had erased the terrifying reality of the barred window and the chain-link fence, and replaced it with the comforting fantasy of a kind old man in the woods. I hadn't created an imaginary friend. I had adopted a real one, a real, tragic, and deeply broken man who had found his own audience of one in a lonely little boy who just wanted to hear a song. The song is no longer a comfort to me. I can't hear it in my head without also hearing the scream that ended it. It is a permanent reminder that the walls we build to protect ourselves, the walls of a house, the walls of an asylum, the walls of our own memory, are never as strong as we think, and that sometimes the most terrifying voices are the real ones, singing their sadness out into a world that isn't listening.
Can you see me?
Our next story is about the layers of history that exist just beneath the surface of our everyday lives. It comes from a family man named Mark, who learned that sometimes the most terrifying secrets aren't buried in the ground, but sealed just behind a thin layer of drywall, and that a child's imaginary friend can be a key to unlocking a long-forgotten, very real nightmare. Mark and his wife, Helen, were not wealthy people. They were, however, resourceful. Mark was a general contractor, a man who could see the hidden potential in things others considered broken. Helen was a substitute teacher, a job that offered flexibility but little financial security. Their life was a carefully managed budget, a constant juggling act of bills and dreams. Their biggest dream had just come true. Their first home. It was a 1950s bungalow in Ferndale, Michigan, a modest suburb of Detroit known for its older, character-filled houses. They bought it at a foreclosure auction, a flipper's special that had scared off other buyers. The foundation was solid, but every surface was a testament to decades of neglect. For Mark, this wasn't a problem. It was a challenge. For his 8-year-old son, Jacob, it was simply an adventure. The first few months were a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Mark spent his weekends tearing down walls, replacing old wiring and sanding floors. The house filled with the sounds of construction and the smell of sawdust. Jacob, a quiet and imaginative boy, was given the first room to be completed. It was a small, simple room at the back of the house, overlooking a yard full of weeds. Mark had patched the plaster, put up fresh drywall, and given it 2 coats of a cheerful sky blue paint. It was a clean slate, a perfect blank canvas for his son's childhood. The stain appeared about a week after the paint had dried. It was a small, irregular blotch on the wall beside Jacob's bed, about the size of a child's hand. It was a faint brownish yellow, like an old water stain. Mark was annoyed, but not alarmed. He'd said to Helen with a sigh, "Old houses. Probably a bit of moisture wicked through the new plaster from the old lath. Behind it, I'll hit it with some primer and another coat of paint this weekend." He did just that. He carefully applied a coat of stain-blocking primer, waited for it to dry, and then painted over it with the same sky blue. The wall was perfect again, a seamless expanse of cheerful color. The next morning, the stain was back, a faint shadow bleeding through the fresh paint, as if it had never been covered at all. This time, Mark was frustrated. He assumed he'd used the wrong kind of primer. He went to the local Sherwin-Williams on Woodward Avenue and bought the most expensive, industrial-grade sealant they had. He repeated the process, this time with 2 coats of sealant and 2 more coats of paint. For a week, the wall remained perfect. Then, slowly, imperceptibly at first, the stain began to re-emerge, a ghostly echo of its former self, a persistent bruise on the skin of their new home. It was around this time that Jacob's new friend appeared. Mark and Helen would hear him in his room, whispering and laughing to himself. When they asked who he was talking to, Jacob would smile and say, "I'm talking to Smiley." Helen asked, playing along, "And who is Smiley?" Jacob pointed to the faint brownish blotch on the wall. "He lives there, in the funny spot. He's my best friend." It was the kind of thing that would have charmed any other parent. An imaginative boy, creating a friend from a simple imperfection. In his room. But for Mark and Helen, knowing the persistent, almost unnatural nature of the stain, it felt unsettling. Still, they dismissed it as a childhood phase, a coping mechanism for the stress of moving to a new house. The conversations between Jacob and Smiley became a nightly ritual. Jacob would lie in his bed, his head turned towards the wall, and whisper for hours into the darkness. Mark and Helen, listening from the hallway, could only hear one side of the conversation. They heard their son asking questions. "Are you scared in there? Was it loud? Do you miss your mommy?" Followed by long, silent pauses where he was clearly listening to a response. One night, Jacob came into the living room, his face serious. "Mommy, Smiley says there's a cold spot in the floor by the window." Helen looked at Mark, a questioning eyebrow raised. To humor his son, Mark went into Jacob's room and knelt by the window, and he felt it, a distinct, noticeable draft coming up from the floorboards. The next day, he went into the crawl space under the house and found what he had expected, an old, poorly sealed ventilation grate, letting in the cold Michigan air. He sealed it up with foam and caulk. Mark asked Jacob later, "How did you know about that, buddy?" Jacob just shrugged. Smiley told me. He knows all the secrets of the house. The incident was strange, but Mark explained it away. Jacob had probably felt the draft himself subconsciously. It was a logical, if slightly strained, explanation, but it was harder to explain the gifts. They started appearing a few weeks later. Jacob would run out of his room in the morning, his face alight with excitement, clutching a small, strange object. The first was an old coin, a mercury dime from 1942. Covered in a patina of age. He exclaimed. Smiley left it for me. Mark and Helen assumed he'd found it in the backyard, a relic from the previous owners. A week later, it was a small, tarnished silver button, the kind from an old-fashioned dress. Then, a few days after that, the most disturbing gift of all. Jacob ran to them, holding a small, yellowed object in the palm of his hand. It was a child's baby tooth. Helen asked, her voice trembling slightly, her face pale, "Where did you get this, Jacob?" Jacob said, his voice full of innocent pride, "Smiley gave it to me. He said he doesn't need it anymore." That was the turning point. This was no longer a harmless game. The coin and the button could have been found. But a tooth? Where could a 7-year-old boy have possibly found a child's tooth? They searched his room, his toy box, his pockets. Nothing. They questioned him gently, firmly, but his story never wavered. Smiley had given it to him. It had just appeared at the bottom of the wall, right below the stain. Mark and Helen were now deeply, truly scared. They didn't know what they were dealing with, but they knew it wasn't just a child's imagination. The house itself felt different. The air felt heavier. The normal creaks and groans of the old structure now sounded like whispers, like movement in the walls. The strange pronouncements from Jacob continued. One evening, he told his mother, his voice a sad whisper, "Smiley is sad. He lost his favorite toy car, a little red one, with a silver wheel that always fell off." He described the toy with a detail that was chillingly specific. 2 weeks later, Mark was in the backyard, digging a new trench for a drainage pipe. His shovel hit something hard. He knelt down and pulled a small metal object from the damp earth. It was a toy car, a little die-cast roadster, its red paint almost completely gone, covered in rust. And one of its small silver wheels was missing. He stood there in the quiet backyard, the rusted toy car in his hand, and he felt the last of his rational explanations crumble into dust. This wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a game. Something was in their house. Something that was communicating with his son, something that knew the long-buried secrets of the property. Jacob, meanwhile, became more withdrawn, more attached to the stain on the wall. He would spend hours in his room, not playing with his toys, but just lying on the floor, his hand pressed against the wall, whispering. Helen would find him like that, seemingly in a trance. When she would call his name, he would startle, as if being pulled from a deep dream. The final straw came a month later. A smell. It started faintly. A sweet, cloying, sickly odor that seemed to be coming from Jacob's room. They cleaned the room from top to bottom, washed the bedding, aired it out, but the smell persisted. And it was strongest near the wall. Near the stain. It was the smell of decay. Mark said that evening, his face a grim mask of resolve. "That's it. I don't care what it is. A dead animal, a burst pipe, mold. I'm cutting it out. I'm cutting that whole section of wall out right now." He went to his truck and came back with his drywall saw and a heavy pry bar. Helen took a crying, protesting Jacob into the living room. Mark went into the bedroom, the smell now thick and nauseating in the air. he stood before the faint brown stain, the place where his son's secret friend lived. He took his saw and made the first cut. The blade bit into the drywall with a rough, grating sound. He cut a large, 2-foot by 2-foot square around the stain. The smell intensified, a wave of rot that made him gag. He inserted the pry bar into the cut and pulled. The section of drywall came away with a groan of protest, revealing the dark, hollow space behind it. He shone his flashlight into the opening, expecting to see the remains of a squirrel or a raccoon, or the dark, wet stain of a leaking pipe, but he saw none of those things. Behind the drywall was not lath and plaster, but a solid steel plate. Rusted at the edges, it was the door of an old wall safe. The kind that had been common in houses of this era. It had been plastered and painted over, hidden from view for decades, and the smell, the god-awful, sweet smell of decay, was seeping from the rusted seams around the safe's door. He yelled for Helen. She came running, her face pale. They stood together, staring at the impossible discovery. She whispered, "A safe?" Mark said, his voice low. "It's been sealed for a long time." Using the pry bar, he wedged it into the seam of the safe door and pulled with all his strength. The rusted metal groaned, then bent. He pulled again and the door broke free, falling to the floor with a heavy metallic clang. The smell that erupted from the opening was overwhelming. A thick, putrid wave of decay that made them both stumble back, covering their noses. Mark shone his flashlight into the dark interior of the yeast vinyl safe. He wished he hadn't. Inside, nestled on a bed of what had once been a child's blanket, was a small pile of bones. Tiny, delicate, human bones, a child's bones. Beside them lay a collection of small, tragic treasures, a tarnished silver button, a mercury dime, a small, rusted toy car with a missing wheel, and a single yellowed baby tooth. Tucked underneath the blanket was a small, leather-bound diary. With a shaking hand, Mark reached in and took it. He opened it. The handwriting was a child's scrawl. The last entry, dated 1958, was almost illegible. "Daddy was mad again. He put me in the quiet place. It's so dark in here. He says I have to be quiet, but I can still hear them. He's putting up a new wall. I'm scared. My name is Thomas. I am 7 years old. Can anyone see me?" Mark and Helen stood in the silent, blue-painted room, the truth of the last few months crashing down on them with the force of a physical blow. Their son's imaginary friend hadn't been a ghost. He hadn't been a product of imagination. He had been a real little boy named Thomas, a child who had been sealed in this wall 50 years ago, a victim of an unimaginable horror. The stain on the wall hadn't been a water leak. It was the slow, seeping residue of a life that had ended in that dark, silent space. The gifts hadn't been magic. They were small objects, pushed through a tiny crack in the back of the safe by a boy who just wanted someone to know he was there. And Jacob, he hadn't been talking to himself. He had been listening to the faint, desperate whispers of a lost little boy, echoes of a tragedy trapped in the very walls of his room. The house hadn't been haunted by a ghost. It had been haunted by a memory, a real, tangible, and heartbreaking memory that had finally, after 50 years of silence, found someone who was willing to listen.
He's a bad man.
Our next story is about the quiet poison that can seep into the foundations of a happy home. It's about the trust between a child and a parent, and how that sacred bond can be twisted into a weapon. It comes from a woman named Sarah, who learned that her imaginary friend wasn't a playmate, but a saboteur, a ghost of a different kind, a living, breathing grudge that used her innocence to wage a silent psychological war against the man she loved most, her father. My story begins in a place that was, by all accounts, perfect. we lived in Naperville, Illinois, in a beautiful two-story house on a street named Bower Road, the kind of place people move to when they want to escape the chaos of Chicago. It was the American dream, rendered in beige siding and manicured lawns. My father, David, was a man built of quiet strength and integrity. He ran his own small construction company, a business he built from the ground up. He came home every night smelling of pine wood and hard work, his hands calloused but always gentle. My mother, Emily, was a high school English teacher, a woman of warmth and endless patience. I was 6 years old, their only child, and my world was a fortress of unwavering love and security. The foundations were solid. Or so I thought. That was the year I met Charlie. I was playing in my playroom, a bright sunlit space above the garage. When I first heard his voice, it was a whisper, seeming to come from the small, circular vent in the wall that connected to the garage's ventilation system. It said, "Hello?" I wasn't scared. I was a child, and the world was still a place of boundless magical possibilities. I whispered back, "Who are you?" The voice replied, "I'm Charlie. I'm your new friend. I live in the walls." And just like that, Charlie became my constant companion. He was my secret. My parents, like all parents of imaginative children, accepted him as a normal part of my development. They'd hear me whispering to the vent and would smile. My mom would ask, "Who's Charlie talking about today, sweetie?" I'd relay his stories, tales of a magical world inside the walls, a place made of wires and dust bunnies and forgotten things. It was a harmless, charming fantasy. Charlie was a wonderful friend at first. He was funny, he was a great listener, and he knew everything. He knew when my mom was coming home from her job at Naperville Central High School because he could hear her car on the wind. He knew where my dad had hidden my birthday presents in the garage because he could see through the walls. To my 6-year-old mind, Charlie was magic. I now know that he was simply an observer with a direct line of sight from the garage's ventilation system into our daily lives. The shift was subtle. It began with questions. He would whisper, "Why is your dad always so loud, Sarah?" My dad wasn't a loud man, but he had a deep, booming laugh that would shake the house. Charlie would add, "He sounds angry," a seed of doubt planted. Then the comments became more pointed. "Your dad is a bad man, Sarah. He hides things." He would guide me to find mundane things, a missing screwdriver, a misplaced set of blueprints, presenting them as proof of my father's deceit. He was slowly, methodically painting my father as a villain in the story of our own family. I loved my dad. He was my hero, but Charlie was my friend, my secret. I was torn, a small child caught in a silent loyalty battle. I started watching my father with a new, hesitant uncertainty. His booming laugh started to sound less like joy and more like aggression. His quiet moods, a result of a stressful workday, seemed like a confirmation of his badness. The poison was working. The games began a few weeks later. Charlie would whisper, "Let's play a trick on your dad. He won't think it's funny. Bad men don't like jokes." The first game was simple. Hide his car keys. I took them from the hook by the door and hid them in the piano bench. The morning was chaos. My dad was late for a meeting with a client, his frustration growing with every passing minute. I sat at the breakfast table, a knot of guilt and fear in my stomach, while Charlie whispered his approval through the floor vents. "See? He's angry. I told you." My mother eventually found the keys, and I was given a stern but gentle talking to. But the damage was done. I had seen my father angry, just as Charlie had predicted. In my child's mind, it was a confirmation, not a consequence of my own actions. The incidents escalated. A cup of coffee accidentally spilled on important blueprints. A garden hose left on overnight, flooding the flower beds my dad had spent a weekend planting. Each time, it was a trick suggested by Charlie, and each time, my father's understandable frustration was framed by Charlie as proof of his inherent meanness. My mother grew worried that she saw the change in me, my new skittishness around my own father. She saw the growing tension between me and David. She suggested therapy. My dad, a practical, no-nonsense man, refused. She's a kid, Emily. She's just testing boundaries. He couldn't see the full picture. He couldn't see the invisible puppeteer pulling the strings from inside the walls of our own home. The first major accident happened in the fall. My dad was on a ladder, cleaning the gutters along the side of the garage. The day before, Charlie had whispered to me, "Ladders are wobbly, Sarah, especially when someone isn't paying attention. Your dad is going to get a big scare tomorrow." I was in the backyard, watching, my stomach in knots. I wanted to warn him, but how could I explain? I just watched as my dad reached for a stubborn clump of leaves, and then I saw it. The base of the aluminum ladder, which had been firmly planted on the grass, slid a few inches on a patch of wet leaves. The ladder wobbled violently. My dad yelled, his arms flailing, but he managed to grab onto the gutter and regain his balance. He climbed down, his face pale, his hands shaking. He muttered that was close. He checked the base of the ladder and kicking away the wet leaves. It was an accident. A completely plausible, mundane accident. But I knew better. Charlie had known it was going to happen. The thought was terrifying. He wasn't just my friend. He was a prophet of my father's pain. The domestic Cold War continued for months. My father became more withdrawn, confused by the strange, targeted chaos that had invaded his orderly life. My mother became more protective of me, creating a subtle rift between them. I was trapped in the middle, a silent, terrified accomplice. I started having nightmares. I would dream of my house, but the walls were made of glass, and a tall, shadowy figure stood on the other side, watching us. The final act of this quiet, insidious play came on a cold Saturday in March. My dad was in the garage, a space he loved. It was his sanctuary, a place of order and creation. He was working on his passion project, restoring a vintage 1967 Ford Mustang. He had spent years collecting the parts. The final piece was the heavy, solid steel hood, which he had finally managed to acquire and was planning to mount that day. He was using a chain hoist, rigged to a thick beam in the garage ceiling, to lift it into place. The night before, Charlie's voice had been different. It wasn't the usual playful, conspiratorial whisper. It was cold, flat, and final. He'd whispered through the vent. Tomorrow is a big day. Sarah, your dad is going to finish his project. He's going to get a big OE. And after tomorrow, he won't be able to be mean anymore. He'll be quiet, just like us. The words chilled me to the bone. This wasn't a game. This was a threat. The next morning, I was a wreck. I begged my dad not to go into the garage. I feigned a stomachache. I threw a tantrum. I cried, "I don't want you to go in there. It's dangerous." My father, his patience worn thin from months of my strange behavior, was firm. His voice was stern. "Sarah, that's enough. It's a garage. I'll be fine. You need to stop this nonsense." His stern tone was all the confirmation Charlie needed. I could almost hear his whisper in my head. "See? Angry. I told you." I watched from the kitchen window as my dad disappeared into the garage. An hour later, we heard the scream. It wasn't a scream of pain. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated rage and terror. My mom and I ran to the garage. We found my dad standing in the middle of the room, his face as white as a sheet. He was staring at the chain hoist. The heavy steel hook, which should have been holding the massive car hood, was empty. The hood itself was on the floor, directly below, crumpled and dented from a significant impact. But that wasn't the source of his terror. Lying on the floor, crushed beneath where the hood had fallen, was a single, child-sized sleeping bag and a small pile of empty food wrappers and water bottles. My dad whispered, his voice trembling, "Someone Someone was living in here. Right. Above my workbench. In the rafters. The chain on the hoist hadn't broken. The bolt holding it to the ceiling beam had been deliberately, methodically loosened over time. Just enough so that the weight of the heavy hood would be the final straw. It wasn't an accident. It was an attempted murder. And the sleeping bag proved that the culprit had been sleeping just a few feet away from the trap they had set. It was in that moment of chaos and flashing police lights that my mother made the final connection. She ran back into the house, into my playroom, and straight to the ventilation grate. She pressed her ear against the cold metal dot, and from the other side, she heard it. The faint, panicked sound of someone scrambling, of clothes rustling, of a person moving through the hidden spaces of our home. The man, a former employee my father had fired for theft and erratic behavior 6 months prior, had been living in our walls the entire time. His name was Charles, but he went by Charlie. He had been a ghost in our home, a silent observer who had turned my own childhood innocence into a weapon for his twisted revenge. The police found his makeshift nest in the crawl space above the garage, a place of filth and obsessive hatred. They found his notebooks, filled with meticulous logs of our family's comings and goings, and they found the small, hidden microphone. He had snaked through the ventilation system, which allowed him to whisper his poison directly into my room. He was caught a few days later, trying to hitch a ride out of state on I-55, but the real damage was already done. The fortress of my childhood had been breached from the inside. The foundations of my family, which I had thought were so solid, had been cracked. My father recovered from his injuries, but a part of his spirit, his easy laugh, his unwavering sense of security in the world, was gone forever. I am an adult now, with a home of my own, but I am haunted by the memory of Charlie. Not the monster, but the friend. I am haunted by the knowledge of how easily trust can be manipulated, how a child's love can be weaponized. The monster in my story wasn't a ghost or a demon. He was a man, a real, flesh and blood man with a grudge. And he taught me the most terrifying lesson of all. You can have the strongest locks in the world, but they are useless when you are the one who willingly invites the monster in.
Draw me.
Our next story is about the chilling clarity of a child's vision. It comes from a young mother named Karen, who learned that sometimes the line between imagination and observation is terrifyingly thin, and that a simple crayon drawing can be a map to a forgotten, real-world horror. She discovered that her son's imaginary friend wasn't a fantasy, but a memory that was still alive and still watching. In the autumn of 2018, Corinne and her 6-year-old son, Sam, moved to Arcata, California. It was an escape. An escape from a bitter divorce, from the suffocating smog of Los Angeles, and from a life that had become a ghost of its former self. Humboldt County, with its towering redwood forests and its persistent, moody fog, felt like the edge of the world, a perfect place to disappear and start over. Their new home was a small, 2-bedroom rental house on the outskirts of town, nestled against the dense, primordial expanse of the Arcata Community Forest. The house was old, smelled perpetually of damp earth and pine needles, and was constantly shrouded in a soft gray. Miss for Karen, a freelance medical transcriber struggling to make ends meet. It was all they could afford. For Sam, a quiet, introspective boy who preferred drawing to playing. It was a magical, mysterious new kingdom. The loneliness of their new life was a tangible thing. Karen worked from a small desk in the corner of the living room. Their days a monotonous cycle of typing and listening to doctors' dictations, the medical jargon a sterile counterpoint to the wild, organic silence of the forest outside her window. Sam was having trouble making friends at his new school, Jacoby Creek Elementary. He spent most of his time in his room, drawing. His world was one of paper and crayons. It was in this quiet, isolated world that Sam's new friend appeared. His name was the tall man from the trees. He wasn't a monster. According to Sam, he was a nice man. He was just sad. Sam would say, his brow furrowed with a child's profound empathy. He misses his colors. Karen, like any loving parent, played along. She saw the tall man as a coping mechanism, a necessary fantasy for a lonely boy in a new, strange place. She would ask Dot, what does he look like? Sam would reply vaguely, he's just tall and he has sad eyes. The tall man had rules. He never came inside the house. He only ever appeared in the backyard, near the edge of the forest. And he was very, very quiet. Sam would spend hours by the back window, his sketchpad in his lap, having long, one-sided conversations with his silent friend in the trees. Karen would watch him, her heart aching with a mixture of love and a quiet, gnawing guilt over their isolated life. The first hint that the tall man was more than just an imaginary friend was subtle. Sam started drawing with a new, startling level of detail. His usual childlike scribbles of stick figures and floating houses were replaced by intricate, realistic sketches of the forest. He would draw specific trees with a stunning accuracy, capturing the unique pattern of their bark, the way a particular branch was twisted. He would explain simply when Karen praised his work. The tall man showed me how. One afternoon, Sam came to her, his face a mask of serious concentration, and presented her with a new drawing. His voice was a proud whisper. I drew him. I drew the tall man. Karen took the piece of paper, expecting to see a child's typical rendering of a tall stick figure, but her smile froze on her face. The drawing was not a scribbled dot, it was a portrait, a detailed, hauntingly realistic portrait of a man's face, done with a simple black crayon. The man in the drawing had a long, thin face, high cheekbones, and deep-set, sorrowful eyes that seemed to stare right through her. His hair was long and unkempt, and he had a short, patchy beard. But it was the detail that was so impossible. The artist, whoever they were, had captured a specific mole just above the man's left eyebrow and a small, thin scar that ran through his right dot. It was the work of a skilled portrait artist, not a 6-year-old boy. She trailed off, unable to finish. Sam, honey, did someone help you with this? His eyes were wide and honest. No. Mommy, the tall man told me how to do it. He told me where to put the lines. He said it was important that you see his real face. A cold, creeping dread began to snake its way up her spine. She stared at the drawing, at the sad, haunted eyes of the man her son had captured with impossible precision. This wasn't imagination. This was a rendering from life. This was the face of a real person. She tried to rationalize it. Had Sam seen a picture somewhere? On the internet? In a book? She questioned him gently, but his story never changed. He had never seen a photo. The tall man was his friend. He lived in the trees. That night, after Sam was asleep, Karen couldn't shake the image of the man in the drawing. She found herself standing by the back window, staring out at the dark, impenetrable wall of the redwood forest. The usual, comforting silence of the night now felt menacing, watchful. She felt a profound, terrifying certainty that someone was out there in the darkness, looking back at her. The next day, she decided to take a walk into town, hoping to clear her head. As she was passing a local coffee shop, Lost Bagels on I Street, she saw a taped to the inside of the window. Amongst the local event flyers and community notices was a poster, a missing person poster. It was old, faded, the edges curled and water dash stained. But the face on it, it was the same face. Her heart stopped. The same long, thin face, the same deep-set, sorrowful eyes, the same mole, the same scar. The text below the photo was faded, but she could make out the name, Elias Thorne, and the date he was last seen, October 14th, 1998. 20 years ago. She stumbled back from the window, her mind reeling. Her son's imaginary friend wasn't just real. He was a man who had vanished from this very town 2 decades ago. She spent the rest of the day in a frantic, obsessive haze of research at the Arcata branch of the Humboldt County Library. The librarians helped her pull up old microfiche records from the local paper, the Arcata. She found the stories about Elias Thorne. He had been a reclusive, brilliant artist who had lived in a small cabin on the edge of the community forest, the same area where her rental house now stood. He was known for his hauntingly realistic portraits and his obsession with the redwood trees. He had walked into the forest one autumn afternoon and never been seen again. No body was ever found. The case had long gone cold. Another sad, unsolved mystery in a county infamous for them. The articles included a photo of Elias, a grainy newspaper image that confirmed what she already knew. It was the man from Sam's drawing. She found an interview with his sister, given a year after his disappearance. In it, she described her brother's strange habits. She said he was a gentle but deeply troubled soul. She mentioned his love for birdwatching, how he would spend hours sitting by a specific window in his cabin, sketching the Steller's jays that nested in the old pine tree. Karen felt a chill run through her. The window in Sam's bedroom, the one he spent hours looking out of, faced an old, massive pine tree. She went home, her mind a maelstrom of fear and impossible questions. Was her son being haunted by the ghost of a dead artist? She didn't believe in ghosts, but what was the alternative? That a 6-year-old boy had somehow, impossibly, channeled the memory of a man who had disappeared before he was born, right down to the last detail of his face. That night, a new detail emerged. She was putting Sam to bed. He was quieter than usual. She asked, tucking him in, "What's wrong, sweetie?" Sam whispered, his eyes on the dark window. "The tall man is sad tonight. He said the bad men broke his colors." "What does that mean, honey?" His voice was small. His crayons. He said they broke all his crayons and hid his favorite pictures in the cold, dark place under the floor. Now he can't draw the birds anymore. The childish words spoken with such profound sadness were like a key turning in a lock. A cold, dark place under the floor. After Sam was asleep, Karen went to his bedroom. She stood in the center of the room, her heart pounding. The floor was old hardwood. She knelt down and ran her hands over the floorboards near the window, the spot where Sam always sat, the spot where Elias Thorne might have sat. She felt for a loose board, a seam, anything, and she found it. Under the small area rug, one of the floorboards felt different. It was slightly raised, the nails at one end missing. Using the edge of a butter knife from the kitchen, she pried it up. It came away easily, revealing a small, dark crawl space-like cavity beneath the floor. The air that rose from it was cold and smelled of dust and turpentine. She shone her phone's flashlight into the opening, and she saw it. It wasn't crayons. It was a long, flat, leather portfolio covered in mold and mildew. With a trembling hand, she reached in and pulled it out. She took it to the living room and laid it on the floor. It was heavy, the leather cracked with age. She untied the simple leather straps and opened it. The portfolio was filled with charcoal sketches. Dozens of them. The first ones were breathtaking. Sketches of the redwood forest, of birds, of light filtering through the canopy, all rendered with a stunning, heartbreaking beauty. This was Elias Thorne's work. She carefully lifted the first stack of drawings. The sketches underneath were different. They were portraits. Dozens of portraits of people she didn't recognize, their faces rendered with that same haunting, sorrowful detail. Then she got to the bottom layer, and the breath left her body in a silent, horrified rush. The last set of drawings were not of strangers. They were of her and of Sam. There were dozens of them. Sketches of her, Working at her desk, her face illuminated by her laptop screen. Sketches of Sam playing on the floor of his room. Sketches of them eating dinner together in the kitchen. They were impossibly detailed, capturing moments of their private lives with a terrifying intimacy. And they were drawn from an impossible perspective from a high corner of the room, from outside the window, looking in from inside the closet. He hadn't been a ghost. He hadn't been a memory. He had been real and he hadn't disappeared 20 years ago. Elias Thorne, the reclusive artist, the tall man from the trees, had been living in the hidden, forgotten spaces of their house this entire time. A silent, secret roommate. Her son's imaginary friend was a real man who had been watching them, studying them, sketching them from the shadows of their own home. She flipped to the last drawing in the portfolio. It was a single, terrifyingly detailed portrait of her son, Sam, asleep in his bed, his face peaceful and unaware. Underneath the drawing, in elegant, spidery script, was a title and a date. It read, "My new son, Sam, October 28th, 2018. Tomorrow's date." A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Just outside the living room door, Karen froze, her eyes locked on the drawing, on the date. The house, which she had thought was a sanctuary, was a shared cage, and she realized, with a final, soul-shattering certainty, that her son's imaginary friend had just decided that he was done being imaginary.
It's my turn now.
Our next story is about the quiet covenants of childhood, the secret friendships that bloom in the unnoticed corners of our world. It comes from a father named Michael, a man who believed that the greatest dangers were the ones he could see and measure. He would learn that the most profound threats are often silent, patient, and hidden in plain sight, and that the comforting rhythm of a child's play can be the ticking of a clock counting down to a horrifying revelation. Michael's life was a carefully constructed fortress of responsibility. He was a 38-year-old civil engineer, a man who spent his days calculating load-bearing capacities and tensile strengths for the city of Denver. His world was one of concrete, steel, and verifiable data. The only variable he couldn't quite quantify was his 6-year-old daughter, Chloe. After a difficult divorce, Chloe had become his entire world. They had just moved into a new starter home in Highlands Ranch, a sprawling master-planned community south of Denver. The house was smaller than he would have liked, the mortgage a constant low-grade hum of anxiety in the back of his mind. But it had one perfect feature, a backyard that opened directly onto the manicured greenbelt of Dad Clark Park. For Michael, the park was a godsend. It was their shared sanctuary. Every evening after he got home from his downtown office, they would walk the 30 yards from their back gate to the small, secluded playground nestled among the cottonwood trees. It was their ritual, a time to decompress, to reconnect. The playground was simple: a slide, a small climbing structure, and a set of 2 swings. 2 identical, red, plastic swings that hung from a sturdy metal A-frame. It was on a crisp October evening, the sky a brilliant, bruised purple of a Colorado sunset, that Chloe's new friend first made her presence known. Michael was pushing Chloe on her favorite swing, the one on the right. She would laugh her small legs kicking with joy. Higher, Daddy, higher. It was a perfect, ordinary moment of fatherly love, he said, giving her another gentle push. "Okay, little bird, but hold on tight." As she swung forward, his gaze drifted to the swing next to hers, the empty swing, and he noticed something odd. The second swing, the one on the left, was moving. It wasn't just swaying in the breeze. It was moving in perfect, impossible synchrony with Chloe's. As she swung forward, it swung forward. As she reached the apex of her arc and swung back. It swung back. It was a perfect, silent mirror of her own motion. He stopped pushing. Chloe's swing began to slow, its arc diminishing. And as it did, the second swing slowed with it, matching its decaying rhythm perfectly until both swings hung motionless, side by side in the still evening air. A cold, strange feeling prickled at the back of Michael's neck. He looked around. The park was empty. There was no wind dot. He looked at the chains, the joints of the swing set. Everything was normal. He asked Chloe, his voice a little tight. "Did you see that?" Chloe just giggled, her mind already on the slide dot. "See what, Daddy?" He dismissed it. A trick of the eye, an optical illusion caused by the rhythmic motion. His engineer's brain supplied a dozen plausible, if unlikely, explanations. Harmonic resonance, a shared vibration in the structure, a perfectly timed gust of wind dot. He chose to believe one of them. It was easier. But the next evening, it happened again. He pushed Chloe on the right swing, and the left swing began to move with it. A silent, ghostly dance partner. This time, he watched with a focused, analytical intensity. The synchrony was too perfect. It wasn't resonance. It was mimicry. He asked, trying to keep his voice light and playful, "Who is swinging in the other swing, sweetie?" Chloe looked over at the empty, moving swing and smiled a bright, innocent smile. She said simply, "That's for Anna." "Anna?" Michael asked. "Who's Anna?" Chloe said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "She's my new friend. She lives in the park. She likes to swing with me, but she can't do it by herself." An imaginary friend. A wave of relief washed over Michael. Of course. That's what it was. Chloe was lonely, a new kid in a new town. She had created a friend. He had been so focused on the impossible physics of the swing that he'd missed the simple, beautiful logic of a child's imagination. He smiled, a genuine smile this time. "Oh, I see. Well, it's very nice of you to share your swing time with Anna." The friendship with Anna became a central part of their park ritual. Chloe would have long, whispered conversations with the empty swing. Michael would listen, catching snippets of a one-sided dialogue. "No, Anna, you have to keep your feet straight. Don't be scared." It's not that high. To him, it was adorable, a testament to his daughter's kind and creative spirit. But there were strange details. Rules to Chloe's friendship with Anna that he couldn't quite understand. Anna, according to Chloe, never left the playground. She was always there, waiting. And Anna, Chloe explained one evening with a matter-of-fact seriousness, couldn't play on the slide or the climbing structure. Michael had asked, "Why not, sweetie?" Chloe had replied, her voice a whisper, "Because Anna doesn't have any legs." The statement, delivered with such childish innocence, sent a jolt of ice through Michael's veins. It was such a specific, morbid, and deeply unsettling detail. Where would a 6-year-old even come up with an idea like that? He asked her, but Chloe just shrugged. She just doesn't. That's why I have to help her swing. The detail gnawed him. The image of a legless child, a friend for his daughter, was a crack in the charming fantasy. It felt wrong. He started watching Chloe more closely when they were at the park. He noticed that she would sometimes bring things for Anna. A pretty rock, a flower she had picked. She would place them gently on the seat of the empty swing, and when they left the park, the objects would be gone. He assumed she was just moving them herself, a part of the game. The real shift came a few weeks later. The weather had turned, a cold front moving down from the Rockies, bringing an early, wet snow. The park was deserted, covered in a thin, slushy blanket of white. Chloe was bundled in her snowsuit, her cheeks red from the cold. She insisted on going to the swings. Michael had said, "It's too cold to swing, little bird." She'd insisted, her lower lip trembling. "But Anna is waiting for me. She'd be all cold and lonely." He had relented. They walked through the wet snow to the Playground. The swings were covered in a thin layer of ice and snow. Michael cleaned off the seat of the right swing for Chloe. She asked, her voice full of concern. What about Anna's swing? He said gently, Anna can stay warm at home today. Chloe's voice was firm. No, Daddy. Her swing has to be clean. It's the rule. Sighing, Michael brushed the snow and ice from the seat of the second swing. As his gloved hand moved across the cold, red plastic, his fingers snagged on something. He paused. Tucked into the small gap between the plastic seat and the metal, chain link was a thin, almost invisible wire. It felt like a high tensile fishing line. He frowned, pulling at it. It was taut, anchored to the underside of the swing. He followed the line with his eyes. It was nearly impossible to see against the gray, overcast sky. It ran from the swing, up towards the top bar of the A-frame, and then it stretched away from the playground, disappearing into a dense, overgrown thicket of wild rosebush and old trees that bordered the back of an adjacent property, about 50 yards from the swing set. His heart began to pound, a slow, heavy, sickening rhythm, the harmonic resonance, the perfectly timed gusts of wind. The beautiful logic of a child's imagination. It was all a lie. The swing wasn't moving on its own. It was being moved. Someone had been sitting in that thicket of bushes, day after day, pulling a thin, invisible wire in perfect synchrony with his daughter's movements. Someone had been performing for her. For them, someone had been pretending to be Anna. A wave of pure, white-hot rage, followed by an icy wave of terror, washed over him. His daughter hadn't been playing with an imaginary friend. She had been playing with a stranger who had been watching them, studying them for weeks, a patient, silent predator hidden just a few dozen yards from where his child played every single day. He looked at Chloe, her innocent face looking up at him, waiting. He had to get her out of there. His voice was a strained, unnatural imitation of calm. You know what, sweetie? It is too cold. Let's go home and have some hot chocolate. We'll come back and see Anna tomorrow. He scooped her up and carried her back to the house, his mind racing. Who was it? What did they want? The detail about Anna not having legs. It clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The person in the bush wasn't standing. They were sitting, hidden, motionless, except for the small, subtle movements of their hands. Back in the safety of their locked house, he waited until Chloe was absorbed in a cartoon, then went to his office and pulled up the property records for the house behind the thicket. It belonged to an elderly woman, a recluse named Elspeth Crow, who had lived there for over 60 years. There were no other registered occupants. He had to know. He called the non-emergency line for the Douglas County Sheriff's Office. He explained the situation, his voice low and urgent, trying his best not to sound like a lunatic. He described the moving swing, the imaginary friend, and most importantly, the wire. 2 deputies arrived 20 minutes later. They were young, professional, and listened to his story with a calm, serious demeanor that he was profoundly grateful for. He walked them out to the park, to the swing set. The thin, nearly invisible line was still there. One deputy stayed at the playground, while the other, following the line, walked cautiously towards the overgrown thicket. The deputy disappeared into the bushes. A few moments later, his voice came crackling over his radio. Dispatch. I've got eyes on the origin point. It's a window. The line is running from the swing set directly to a second-story bedroom. Window of the adjacent property. Michael's blood ran cold. The person hadn't been hiding in the bushes. They had been watching from the comfort of their own home. The deputies went to the front door of the old house. They knocked. There was no answer. They knocked again, louder this time. Finally, the door creaked open and a woman appeared. She was a home care nurse, looking flustered and confused. I'm sorry. Officers. Mrs. Crow is bedridden. She can't come to the door. The deputies explained the situation. The nurse's face went pale. She whispered, "Oh my God, her son, he's here. He's been staying with her for the past few months. He's not well." What they found in that second-story bedroom was not a monster, It was a tragedy. The room belonged to Mrs. Crow's son, a man in his late 40s named Jonathan. He was a frail, painfully thin man, his body confined to a wheelchair, a condition he'd had since a childhood accident. His room was filled with books, maps, and a powerful pair of bird-watching binoculars on a tripod, aimed directly at the playground. And next to the window, there was a small, intricate system of spools and fishing line, rigged to allow him to manipulate the swing from his chair, with minute, almost imperceptible movements of his fingers. He wasn't a predator. He was a prisoner, a lonely, deeply disturbed man trapped in his own broken body. His only connection to the outside world, a view of the park from his bedroom window. He had watched Chloe play every day. He hadn't seen a child to harm. He had seen a kindred spirit, a lonely soul. He hadn't been trying to lure her away. He had been trying to play. The story he had created, the story of Anna, the girl with no legs, had been his own. He had given Chloe an imaginary friend who was just like him. Jonathan was taken for a psychiatric evaluation. The social workers got involved. The quiet tragedy of the Crow House was brought out into the harsh light of day. But for Michael, the resolution brought no comfort. The knowledge of what had happened, of the quiet, intimate connection a complete stranger had formed with his daughter under his very nose, was a permanent scar. He and Chloe still go to the park, but they don't use the swings anymore. Sometimes Michael will look over at the second-story window of the old house next door. It's empty now, but he can't shake the feeling that someone is still there. Watching he learned that the world is full of ghosts, but not all of them are dead. Some are just lonely people, trapped in their own quiet rooms, reaching out in the only way they know how, pulling on invisible strings, trying to make a connection.
Look behind you.
Our final story is about the ghosts that live in our memories, and the photographic proof that sometimes those ghosts were real. It comes from a woman named Isabel, a photographer who learned that the most cherished moments of her childhood were captured with a horrifying secret, hidden just out of focus in the deep shadows of the past. She discovered that her imaginary friend wasn't just a fantasy, but a real, silent figure who had been a part of her life all along. A ghost who had found his way into every single one of her family photos. My story, I suppose, begins with the sea. I grew up in Astoria, Oregon, in an old, salt-battered house on Franklin Avenue that overlooked the mouth of the Columbia River, where it bled into the Pacific. My father was a fisherman, a man whose moods were as unpredictable as the coastal weather. My mother was a librarian, a quiet, gentle soul who found refuge in the ordered silence of books. I was a lonely child, caught in the currents of their often turbulent marriage. My world was one of fog, the mournful cry of foghorns and the endless gray expanse of the ocean. My only true sanctuary was the attic of our house, a dusty, forgotten space filled with old trunks and the ghosts of my family's history. And it was there that I met the captain. He wasn't a boy my age. He was a man. An old sea captain. He told me, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that sounded like waves dragging pebbles across the shore. He wore a heavy, dark coat, even on sunny days, and a captain's hat that was pulled down low, its brim casting his face in a permanent, deep shadow. He was my secret friend, a silent, steady presence in the chaotic sea of my childhood. He never spoke much. Our friendship was one of quiet companionship. I would sit for hours in the dusty attic, surrounded by the forgotten treasures of my ancestors, and tell him my stories, my fears, my dreams. He would just listen, his shadowed head nodding in understanding. He was the one constant in my life. The one person who was always there, always listening. My parents were too consumed by their own storms to notice the quiet harbor I had found. They saw me spending hours in the attic and just assumed I was an introspective child, lost in my own world. They never questioned who I was talking to them. The silence from the attic was a blessing. The captain had one peculiar habit. He loved photographs. Whenever my mom would bring out the old Polaroid camera for a birthday or a holiday, the captain would be there. I wouldn't see him, but I would feel him a cold spot in the air just over my shoulder. His voice was a dry rustle in my ear. A picture captures a moment forever. Izzy Dodd makes sure you can never forget. As I grew older, the demands of the real world, school, friends, the turbulent drama of being a teenager, slowly pulled me away from the quiet of the attic. The captain's whispers faded, replaced by the louder, more insistent voices of my own life. He became a distant, dreamlike memory, a strange and comforting fiction I had created to survive a lonely childhood. Years passed. I left Astoria, went to college in Portland, and became a photographer, a choice I now see was deeply, subconsciously influenced by the ghost in my attic. I fell in love, I got married, and my own life became a collection of new, happier photographs. My father passed away. My mother, unable to live in the old house with its ocean of memories, sold it and moved into a small condo. The house on Franklin Avenue and the captain who lived in its attic were relegated to the past. A chapter one thought was closed forever. The truth came to me in a cardboard box. I was 35 years old, back in my mother's small condo in Astoria to help her downsize. We were going through old boxes, a painful archaeological dig into our family's history in the bottom of a trunk. We found them, dozens of dusty, disorganized albums filled with the photos of my childhood. We spent the afternoon on her living room floor, laughing and crying as we revisited the past. There I was, a gap-toothed 7-year-old on my first day of school. There I was, blowing out the candles on my 10th birthday cake. There I was, a sullen teenager at a family picnic. They were beautiful, normal, happy memories. It was my husband, Mark, who first noticed it. He wasn't burdened by the nostalgia. He was seeing the photos with fresh, objective eyes. He asked, pointing to a photo of my 8th birthday party. Hey, who's this guy? I leaned over. The photo showed me in our backyard, about to hit a pin to Dodd. My friends were cheering in the background. My dad was holding the rope. It was a perfect snapshot of chaotic childhood joy. I asked, "What guy?" Mark said, his finger tapping the edge of the photo. This guy. The one in the background, by the trees. I squinted, my eyes trying to focus on the blurry, out of focus background, and I saw him, standing just at the edge of the woods that bordered our backyard. Partially obscured by the low-hanging branch of a Sitka spruce was a figure, a tall man wearing a dark coat and what looked like a hat. He was just a shape, a background detail I had never noticed before. I said, a strange, cold feeling washing over me. I don't know. Probably one of my dad's friends from the cannery. But as we continued through the albums, he kept appearing. In a photo of me on the beach, he was there, a tall, dark figure standing far down the shore, a motionless silhouette against the gray, misty horizon. In a photo of my first day of school, he was there, a blurred shape in the crowd of other parents standing across the street from John Jacob Astor Elementary. In a photo from a family Christmas. His face, or rather the shadow where his face should be, was faintly visible, looking in through the living room window from the darkness. Outside, he was in dozens of them. Always in the background, always out of focus, always partially obscured by a tree, a crowd, a reflection. He was a ghost in our family history, a silent, persistent, unnoticed observer. Mark said, his voice low, "This is really creepy, Izzy." My mother was silent, her face pale, her hands trembling as she flipped through the pages. She whispered, I never saw him. How did we never see him? We spent the rest of the day looking for him. The game of nostalgia transformed into a terrifying investigation. We would find a photo, and the first thing we would do was scan the background, the shadows, the reflections, searching for the tall man in the dark coat. And we always found him. It was as if he had been posing for the camera, always making sure to be in the shot, but never so clearly that he would be noticed at first glance. The logical explanations began to fall apart. That it couldn't be the same person over a decade of photos. People move. People age, but this figure was a constant, an unchanging silhouette. My husband, ever the pragmatist, suggested it was a camera. Flaw, a recurring lens flare, a strange trick of the light in my mom's old Polaroid. It was a comforting thought. It was also a lie. The final undeniable proof came in the last album. It was a small, leather-bound book filled with photos from the year before we moved into the house on Franklin Avenue. When I was 5, they were photos of our old apartment, of a different life, and he wasn't in any of them. He had only appeared after we moved into that house. And then I found the last photo. It was the very last picture in the album, a photo I had no memory of. It was a picture of me, age 6, sitting in the dusty, dimly lit attic of the old house. I was sitting on an old trunk, smiling at the camera. But I wasn't alone. Standing directly behind me, his hands resting on my small shoulders, was the tall man. This time, he was not in the background. He was not out of focus. He was a central part of the picture. And for the first time, his face was almost clear. The captain's hat was still pulled low, casting his eyes in a deep, impenetrable shadow. But I could see the sharp line of his jaw, his thin, unsmiling lips. And in that moment, the memory, the name, the whispers, all of it came rushing back with the force of a physical blow. A picture captures a moment forever. Izzy, it makes sure you can never forget. I whispered, my voice choked. The captain. What? My husband asked. I said, my voice trembling as I pointed to the figure in the photo. My imaginary friend. His name was the captain. My mother stared at the photo, her face a mask of horror and dawning recognition. She breathed. Oh my God, I remember this photo. Your father took it. He was so angry that day. He said the light in the attic was playing tricks, that there was a strange shadow behind you. He threw the photo in a drawer and never wanted to look at it again. It hadn't been a shadow. It had been him. He had been real, a real man who had been in our attic, who had stood behind me, who had put his hands on my shoulders. My secret friend, my silent companion. He had been a real, living, breathing person. 1,000 questions exploded in my mind. Who was he? How did he get in and out of the house without anyone ever seeing him? What did he want? The last question was the one that terrified me the most. That night, back in my own home in Portland, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my computer, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I searched for the history of our old house on Franklin Avenue. I dug through online property records, census data, old newspaper archives from the ASTORIN. I found the names of the family who had lived there before us. And then I found the story. It was a small, tragic article from 1972. A fisherman named Jonathan McVane, the owner of the house, had been lost. At sea during a storm, his body was never recovered. He left behind a grieving wife and a young daughter. The article included a photo of him, a black and white image of a tall, solemn-looking man in a dark coat and a captain's hat, standing on the deck of his fishing boat. His face was weathered, his eyes sad, but it was him. The jaw, the lips, the piercing gaze I had felt even from the shadows. It was the captain. But he had died. He had died years before I was even born. So who was the man in my photos? The final piece of the puzzle came from a follow-up article a year later. It was a small, human interest story about how the widow, unable to live with the memories, had sold the house. but the article mentioned a strange, sad detail. The man's younger brother, a reclusive and mentally unwell man named Samuel, who had been living with them, had refused to leave. He had a profound, almost pathological attachment to his older brother and to the house. The article ended with a quote from a neighbor, who said that Samuel had told her he would never leave his brother's post. He had eventually been forcibly removed and institutionalized. And there it was. The horrifying, heartbreaking, and deeply human truth. My imaginary friend hadn't been a ghost. He hadn't been a figment of my imagination. He had been Samuel McVane, a lonely, broken man, hiding in the forgotten spaces of his own family home, a house that was no longer his. He hadn't been haunting me. He had been clinging to a ghost of his own, the ghost of his lost brother. He had seen a small, lonely girl who had found refuge in the same attic he did, and he had, in his own fractured way, become her friend, her protector, her captain. The man in my photos wasn't a monster. He was just a sad, lonely man who was lost at sea in his own mind. I sat there in the dark, staring at the old photographs on my screen, and I wept. I wept for the little girl who had been so lonely she had befriended a stranger in the walls. I wept for the terrified parents who had lived with a secret they didn't understand. And most of all, I wept for Samuel, the quiet, sad man who had lived a life of profound loneliness. His only legacy, a series of ghostly, out-of-focus appearances in the background of a stranger's family photos. The final photograph, the one of him with his hands on my shoulders, is no longer just a terrifying image. It's a portrait of two lonely people finding a strange, impossible comfort in the dusty, silent attic of a house that was, for a little while, a sanctuary for them both. The horror isn't that he was real. The horror is that for 30 years, no one else had ever noticed he was there at all. A man in a striped suit, teaching a child how to be silent. A girl hidden behind a wall, kept alive by a secret friendship. A song that was not a memory, but a cry for help from a barred window. These stories peel back the wallpaper of our nostalgia and reveal a terrifying truth. The world of a child is not always a world of innocence. An imaginary friend is supposed to be a safe creation, a friend we invent to protect ourselves from loneliness. But what if that creation is not our own? What if it's an echo of a real person's pain, a real person's secret, or a real person's predatory intent? These accounts show us that a child's mind, in its beautiful and boundless creativity, can also be an open door, a door through which anything or anyone can walk. They leave us with a chilling question that redefines our own past. When you look back on your own childhood, on the secrets you kept, and the friends only you could see, who are you really talking to? If these stories made you remember a friend you had long forgotten, prove you're really here by subscribing to Whispered Fear, leaving a like, and sharing this video. Your support allows us to give a voice to these forgotten secrets. But sometimes, the most terrifying secrets are not kept by others. They are kept by our own minds, written in our own hand. Click the video on your screen now for our next collection of stories. 4 true stories of finding a disturbing note in your own handwriting. See you there, if you recognize yourself.